Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys about a very nuanced topic, and really this comes out of the powerlifting world, but since I am personally messing with a lot of the concurrent and conjugate styles of training, this is something I should probably bring up for clarity, and it has to do with the difference between partial lifts versus accommodating resistance and how they apply to raw lifters so that people understand the difference. You guys will notice I am generally opposed to partial exercises, lockout work, rack pulls above the knee, all this stuff, the stuff I usually trash on because it reduces range of motion that are oftentimes mainstays in the equipped powerlifting world. And people do need to understand the difference between equipped and raw. So when people say, hey, powerlifters do this, well, you got to ask what sort of powerlifter. And I'm not saying that a lot of equipped powerlifters don't pretty much train as raw powerlifters most of the time, and that a lot of them don't have brutally strong raw lifts. I've definitely met some guys who are equipped lifters who have insane raw lifts by any standard, who are ultra jacked, ultra strong. And so I don't want it to come across that way because that wouldn't be true. But generally speaking, accommodating resistance is totally different from partials, in the sense that partials are, again, you're limiting the range of motion so that you can use a heavier weight, right? That's generally the idea. And the whole point there is that it trains you to lift a heavier weight through the easier part of a range of motion of an exercise, because that sometimes helps you with different sticking points when you're wearing a squat suit or a bench shirt. Right? These things that help you lift more weight, sometimes hundreds of pounds more, because they accelerate the weight out of the bottom. And they have different points where maybe they don't apply as much extra force and they don't help you as much. And so training from those specific points with a weight that's heavier than you would ever be able to do raw, because when you have that suit on or that shirt on, you are going to lift more than you could ever lift raw. There's a methodology to that. Right? There's a methodology to that. Whereas an accommodating resistance is the use of things like bands and chains. And this should make sense to most people. Most of you realize when you start doing any exercise, the hardest part of most conventional exercises is at the bottom, right? The bench press, the hardest part is off your chest. The squat, the hardest part is usually a couple inches out of the bottom. The deadlift, the hardest part's off the floor. Now, some people say, well, I feel like I missed a lockout on these. No, because you got fatigued. When you look at basic biomechanics, it should be really, really obvious that there's more tension being applied to the muscles due to the moment arms and everything, of the bones and the joints and tendons, to where the muscles have more tension placed on them with the same amount of weight. In other words, the muscles have more force being applied to them by the downward force of the gravity on the weight. They are having to work harder, therefore, to move through that range of motion. Your muscles have to work harder. Your chest and your triceps have to work harder at the bottom of a bench press than they do the top half, right? Squat, it just gets easier as you go up because the muscles just don't have to work as hard. Now, you might be more fatigued because you expended everything you had at the bottom because it was so damn hard. But that doesn't mean that the top is your weak link. It means that you just fatigued yourself so much with a weight that was too heavy or a rep that you're getting close to failure near the bottom. Deadlift, is very obvious that it's off the bottom. That's why you have people who can rack pull above the knee hundreds of pounds more than they can pull off the floor. Even though there's less total muscles involved, it's just easier from a leverage perspective. Way easier, in addition to moving the weight a shorter distance. So the whole point with accommodating resistance, and again, this carries over really, really well to these shirts and squat suits, because they make the weight easier at the bottom. Right? They help spring you out of the hardest part of the exercise. Knee wraps do the same thing. So accommodating resistance is the use of things like bands or chains or reverse bands to make the weight heavier at the top and lighter at the bottom. Right? If you wrap bands over a bar and you have very little tension at the bottom, and you have 300 pounds on the bar on a bench press, you only have 300 pounds of tension at the bottom, but you might have 400 at the lockout. The same thing with chains. You might have 150 pounds of chains hanging off there that almost none of it is hanging from the bar and not piled up on the floor at the bottom. And so you might have 300 at the bottom and you might have 450 at the top. Reverse bands pull weight off the bottom because you hook them to the top of a rack or whatever. And it allows the full weight that you put on the bar to be implemented at the top, and the bands help pull it out of the bottom. So the whole idea here is that it makes a more natural strength curve for the muscles rather than the moment arms. Now, we could argue from a muscular development perspective, in some cases, this might produce additional hypertrophy. It's not necessarily a bad thing from a hypertrophic standpoint, because you get to the point in the exercise, and some people will argue, so it's like I always say, that there are muscle fibers that can only be recruited. That can only be recruited at different joint angles on an exercise. And there are muscle fibers to a muscle that can work through pretty much the whole range of motion. They really vary all through the muscle. So some people would argue, well, maybe you might get more total development and do more work by doing the bands where you make it harder at the top. And therefore you get a more even strength curve and you're not as fatigued at the bottom. You're still working, you're still recruiting those fibers that are required to work out of the bottom, but then the weight gets harder. Yeah, in some cases it might give you a potential for a hair more muscle fiber stimulation, right? It might do it in some cases. In other cases, it helps teach you to maintain velocity. In other words, what do I always tell people? That you need to lift a weight as explosively as possible while maintaining good form to maximize motor unit recruitment and muscle fiber recruitment. Yeah, data's pretty overwhelming on that. Well, sometimes we start to decelerate near the top, and some of these things can train us to push harder through the points where we might start decelerating, and that might carry over to better neuromuscular efficiency when you go to lift a heavy weight. In some cases, there's some method to the madness on that. I would argue, though, that the extra hypertrophy is going to be fairly minimal, and people would say, well, what do you mean? This might be a way to get around a stagnant point in your training. If you need an exercise variation, doing some change or some bands on a big lift, so that you maintain the same bar path and the same motor pattern, but you get a slightly different training effect, there could be some merit to that, right? To break up a plateau in your training, it might work for that. But in terms of actual work done, not really, because you're going to have to reduce the weight. Right? You're going to have to reduce the weight to deal with the bands and the chains, because you are going to do more work at the top. And if you're trying to do your normal work, it's not going to work. Like if you can do 8 reps of 300 pounds, but then you put enough bands to where you're 300 at the bottom and 400 at the top, you're no longer going to be able to do 8 reps. Your muscle fibers aren't going to allow it. They're going to give out. So your 8 reps might turn into 4 reps. It might turn into 5 reps. So essentially what happens, some of the muscle fibers that work the top parts might get worked a little more. And maybe for some people that might help you gain some extra muscle mass, particularly if you've hit a long plateau or something. There's nothing wrong with it from that perspective to change things up. I wouldn't disagree with it for that. In other words, a few weeks of doing some accommodating resistance for that, not a bad idea. You could definitely do it with dynamic effort work, because there's a whole different beast to that. But in general, the hypertrophic potential is not going to be much more in most cases. It's probably going to be about the same. In some cases, it might even be less in theory, but I'm going to argue it's going to be about the same. And the reason for it is it's still the total amount of work being done. You're still going to be limited by total muscle fiber recruitment, total amount of motor units. You can recruit all of that stuff, fatigue. I mean, a muscle can only do so much work, right? We have a maximum work capacity, a maximum recoverable volume, and that stuff's not going to change just because you throw bands or chains over a bar. But for breaking up some monotony in the training, yeah, absolutely. For training yourself to learn to accelerate harder, maybe building more speed, because it is a hair easier at the bottom now, and then you have to drive through near the top, or as it goes up at all, even the midway mark. Yeah, there's something to that. And I don't think these methods are something we should throw away even for raw lifters because of that. Right? They certainly have their place. And I've used them in the past at certain points. I'll probably use them again at certain points. But I think we need to be careful of an over-reliance on them, because when you start over-relying on accommodating resistance, what happens? You get weaker at the bottom and your maxes start going down. Right? We start missing lifts. We start getting weaker because we have now undertrained the weakest part of our lift. In other words, if you get to the point to where you have been doing whatever for 10 sets of 3 or 10 sets of 2, 300 pounds, right? But now you're doing 270 at the bottom instead of 300 at the bottom, but you're locking out more. Locking out that set of 300, you're locking out 350, 375, but you're undertraining the bottom. Unless the hypertrophy improves and everything else, sometimes we lose that little bit of strength at the bottom. And then if we do that for too long, what happens? our ability to handle a really heavy weight out of the bottom, because we've only used lighter weight for the same reps since that's out of the bottom, reduces slightly, and our maxes go down 1%, 2%, 3%. Something I experienced personally. When you over-rely on these, and you don't do enough bed stop training and enough pause work and enough heavy work out of the bottom, you can run into problems there, right? You can absolutely run into problems. But that doesn't invalidate them as a training tool. I personally like to do a lot of dead stop work at the bottom on all my stuff. That's the bread and butter for me these days. But, at a certain point, when that becomes my strongest point again, I could certainly see merit in doing that and even working some of that stuff back in, because it certainly works and it has its place. My only argument is that, again, an over-reliance on it complicates your training, and in some cases may detrain some of the performance elements you want. Really a point of major contention. And it's something I think that coaches and lifters have to experiment with to some extent to find that balance, to find that right balance there for specifically what they're doing. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.